Turn on your projectors and follow me down the rabbit hole. JJ Hatter welcomes you to Analysis in Wonderland. Today's topic, Jonathan Miller's Alice in Wonderland. After discussing some video games and a stage play in the last 3 videos, I think we should make up the difference by actually talking about a screen adaptation again, don't you? I have mentioned on multiple occasions now that a common theme in many takes on the Alice stories, including not only straight adaptations but also numerous reimaginings, sequels, and so on, is the seemingly basic theme of growing up. The original Carol stories don't really have much of a point to them. Alice doesn't learn anything really by the end of it all, and while one could very easily make the noteworthy argument that both books contain various hidden meanings, they are very subtle and at least a few of them are likely unintentional. However, as I have also stated before more than once, some people feel this very state of chaotic pointlessness, which served its purpose well in Carol's time, now alienates them from the plot, what little there is. So it isn't surprising many people try to stuff something resembling moral fiber into the utterly batty world of Wonderland to give their audience something a little easier to relate to. The theme of Alice growing up and coming into her own as she does so, overcoming her fears, gaining more of an identity, etc., has been done on countless occasions. However, perhaps the most unique and unsettling production to tackle the theme of quote-unquote Alice in adulthood land is the 1966 TV production directed by Jonathan Miller. This particular adaptation is one of 2 I've been requested to do a few times now. I'll probably do the other one of those 2 next month unless something changes. Jonathan Miller was a UK actor, director, and writer who was known for his sense of sardonic humor and darkly surreal style. He gained much of his popularity as one of the key writers and performers of a surreal satire play entitled Beyond the Fringe. However, his production of Alice in Wonderland would perhaps become his best-known piece. The subject matter was an absolutely perfect field for his sense of style and wit. The production was a quote-unquote television play made for the weekly drama anthology series The Wednesday Play. Only a year earlier, the program had been visited by the specter of Lewis Carroll in Dennis Potter's Alice, a production that would become the prototype, so to speak, for the movie Dream Child, which came out 20 years later. Whether this is sheer coincidence or not is anybody's guess. This ambitious and unusual production was shot in monochrome due to the budget issues of the time. Much of 1960s British TV was, in fact, shot in black and white for this very purpose. The TV play was a passion project in the truest sense of the word. Miller wanted to create a more adult version of the story that could appeal to grown-ups and serious critics in a way that perhaps versions like the 1951 Disney movie could not. He also felt that many live-action adaptations had gotten the story all wrong, so to speak, and wanted to create a new live-action rendition that would correct all the perceived issues he personally had with those earlier interpretations. Perhaps because people didn't quite understand Miller's goals with the story, this version was actually, for a time, rated X. Yes, you heard that correctly. Prior to its release, many people, even including descendants of Lewis Carroll and Alice Hargreaves themselves, expressed worry and even outright anger at the notion of an adult Wonderland after learning of this rating. This was largely because they didn't understand what Miller meant by the use of the word adult. In this case, you see, it did not refer to something that would horribly scar children for all eternity, or feature explicit content of any kind. It simply meant that it wasn't a kid's cup of tea. Children could watch it and nothing would likely be harmed, but it wouldn't engage them in the way it might a grown-up with a more analytical mentality. In other words, this Wonderland wasn't just meant to be a silly romp with high-flying hijinks and a cavalcade of silly hats and colorful costumes. It was intended to be a film you're supposed to think about, for lack of a better way of putting it. Indeed, despite the early backlash, over the years, the film has gained not only a significant cult following, but many critics, and of many sorts, often praise this version lavishly, and it has been analyzed and inspected in great detail by many minds wiser than I. So, is all this attention in recent years well-deserved, or was there good reason to be afraid back when the production was still being crafted? In order to discuss this take on the classic tale properly, I should point out that Miller had several goals with this version that tied into righting the wrongs I mentioned he perceived with earlier adaptations. These goals and how they are executed are integral to understanding this version and appreciating it for what it is, and are a major part of its identity and purpose. To conduct this review, I shall start by going bit by bit through some of these goals, and then give my own thoughts on how they work out. And again, as always, all of this is strictly opinion-based. If your thoughts and feelings differ, that is perfectly alright. The first goal of Jonathan Miller in this adaptation was to make this version more accurate than any other to that date. While it has never been confirmed, I know a myth about the production which states that instead of handing the cast scripts, Miller first handed everybody involved a copy of the original book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and then said, "There, that is your script." I don't know if this myth holds any truth, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did. His attention to detail and accuracy and his love of the books is visible even in the end credits of the film, which feature illustrations not by John Tenniel from the original published Alice books, but instead facsimiles of Lewis Carroll's own hand-drawn illustrations from the earlier manuscript of the story, Alice's Adventures Underground. Indeed, this is generally a decently accurate rendition of the Carroll classic. That is to say, it's highly accurate on paper. Miller, despite his want for accuracy, gave his performers near-universal freedom to improvise and add things in, stating he would rein them in when needed. And while most of the dialogue and so forth does stick true to the source material, there are a few moments where that improvisation really shines. The Frog Footman, for instance, is a frequently forgotten and rather minor character in the books, but while his time on screen is phenomenally brief, actor and comedian John Bird's handling of the sequence is fantastic. He strays quite a bit, actually, from what's actually said in the book, but what he says keeps in the spirit of Carroll, and is honestly one of the funniest parts of the film, so I can totally excuse it. Other additions and paraphrases are relatively minor, but they are all noteworthy when they happen, and some are still more extreme than others. It's honestly hard to tell at times, unless you've read the book closely, where Carroll ends and Miller and his actors begin. The second of Miller's goals was more of an aesthetic choice. He wanted to veer away from the more fanciful and light-hearted tone of most earlier adaptations, and present a Wonderland that was nightmarish and psychedelic. A world that isn't necessarily frightening, but is very uncomfortable, and often very random. Well, to say he succeeded is a maddening understatement. You may not know it just by looking at the stills I show you, but this whole production is one of the creepiest and downright weirdest takes on Wonderland ever made, and it becomes so in a way you probably don't expect. The way it's shot, edited, and paced really does make it feel like a very absurd and unpleasant dream. And at times it's honestly even more random and bizarre than the original book, which is saying quite a lot, as you might expect. Much of it is shot on location rather than a studio set, and some of the locations have an air of morbidity to them. For example, there's a rather ghostly building that in real life was a military hospital. You seriously never know what's going to happen next, or where it will occur, and a lot of this world feels like it's out to get you. The experience is like a miserable drunken night that never ends, or an acid trip that goes farther south than Antarctica. The music is part of this trippy experience, of course. It was composed by noted sitar player Ravi Shankar, who, of course, also performed on his sitar for the film's soundtrack. The sitar is the main instrument we hear throughout the film, the only other instruments being an oboe, played by Leon Goossens, and occasionally a piano and a viola, whose players remain anonymous. There are also occasional spatterings of church hymns and other choral or band-based pieces within the context of the story, but they are performed often in an unsettling and at times oppressive manner. This, mixed with the sitar, an instrument with a sound quality many would argue is directly linked to psychedelia and everything that comes with it, gives the whole thing an otherworldly tone. Sometimes the music is beautiful, at times startling, and always it is haunting and deeply moving in some way. Another of Miller's great goals involves the costuming and the cast. He felt the major issue with so many live-action versions that had come beforehand was that they cast great actors in these classic roles only to effectively bury them under cumbersome costumes and ludicrous makeup. In his opinion, this approach deadened the impact of their performances. To a certain extent, one can see what he was getting at. Many of these versions, and tons that followed afterwards, tried to evoke the look and style of John Tenniel's illustrations, but had a hard time adapting that sensibility to cinematic or televised format. Even when that isn't the exact intention, the various animal characters in the story mean clever work has to be done anytime you handle the production with live actors. Miller deliberately decided to forego the animal masks and extremely elaborate makeup designs, and instead this version dresses all the characters, animal or human, in traditional period costumes of the Victorian era. There are, on occasion, certain elements of their outfits that can imply their species, so to speak, much like the later 1999 film would try with some of its characters, but even this is not always consistent. If not for the fact that we are told performers Malcolm Muggeridge and Sir John Gielgud are playing the Griffin and the Mock Turtle respectively, we would have no idea that's what they are meant to be. They look like fairly ordinary people. This costuming style is arguably the single most notable part of the entire production's identity, and is why some people occasionally have a hard time understanding it. To the uninitiated, the Dormouse looks like a relatively average, elderly man. Why doesn't he actually look like a dormouse? I don't personally mind this choice, but I suppose I understand why others may be put off. It's one thing with stage plays, such as the Broadway version of Frank Wildhorn's Wonderland, which at times used a somewhat similar approach of implying the creatures. Still, even there, most of them had tails or other specific elements to their outfits that told you, yes, this was a rabbit, this was a cat, and so on. I guess the ultimate conclusion I can come to is that the costumes are a bit of a love-it-or-leave-it affair. You'll either like the approach and designs, or you'll be very put off by them. If the costumes are something of a hit-and-miss matter, the casting, for the most part, is not. Sort of tied to the previous goal, Miller once again cast numerous major stage and screen actors of the time, several of them close friends of his, to fill out the roles of the Wonderland characters. Peter Cook, Sir Michael Redgrave, Leo McKern, Alison Leggett, even Eric Idle of Monty Python fame has an uncredited cameo in the caucus race scene. It also served as the final on-screen role of actor Wilfrid Lawson, who passed away not so long after this version first aired. 3 of the actors in this production, Alan Bennett, Peter Eyre, and Peter Sellers, would later return to Wonderland. Bennett not only recorded a fairly popular audiobook version of the story, but also voiced the Mock Turtle in 1985's Dream Child. Peter Eyre would return in the 1999 Hallmark film as the Frog Footman. In this movie, he plays the Knave of Hearts. As for Peter Sellers, he would later play the March Hare in the 1972 film starring Fiona Fullerton. In fact, like the 1972 film would later attempt, while Miller casts huge stars and noted character actors in all of these roles, he and his creative team chose the people they chose not only for their star power, but also for their skill, and tried to cast the film with respect to the characters and story, rather than to ratings or just getting some familiar faces on board. While not all of these performances are among my absolute favorite takes on the characters, the majority of them are all simply splendid. There are only 2 exceptions. The first is Michael Gough. He too would return to Wonderland in a later version, as he had a cameo as the Dodo, William, in the first of Tim Burton's Alice movies. In this film, he plays the March Hare, and literally the only reason I don't like his work is because I frankly can't figure out what the heck he is doing. He sits or stands almost totally unmoving for his scenes, almost never looks at anybody, stutters and mutters most of his lines, and his face seems almost permanently set in a cross-looking, snooty expression. I wouldn't mind how baffling these choices are, except that with all the other characters, I can gather what's going on, even when they are particularly odd, even for Wonderland. This one just confuses me and has never struck me as all that appealing. Ultimately, however, Gough's befuddling work is a very minor nitpick. Of much greater issue is our other exception, Anne-Marie Malik as Alice herself. Miller stated he chose this young lady to play Alice because she, and I quote, expressed a very particularly Victorian solemnity. Well, if expressing Victorian solemnity means expressing absolutely nothing with your entire performance consisting of a dead-eyed stare, a raspy monotone voice, and occasionally flipping your hair in a very awkward fashion, I'd say they picked a winner. Apparently Anne-Marie Malik wasn't even a professional actress. This is her only known major role, and she was actually the daughter of a lawyer. While it's not unusual for relative unknowns to be chosen to play Alice in other shows, or even for this story to be their great introduction, so to speak, this is an occasion where the formula just fails. You honestly feel as if all of the fabulous performers in this movie are acting against a solid brick wall. Our Alice here barely reacts to their shenanigans, if she reacts at all. This ties into yet another of Miller's goals. As I said before, this version is focused on the theme of growing up, but it does so in a very different way. Later renditions seem to treat growing up as a somewhat bittersweet, but ultimately productive thing. This movie, however, takes the opposite approach. In Miller's own words, it's all about a small child, surrounded by hurrying, worried people thinking, is that what being grown up is like? The many characters of Wonderland are not as zany or flamboyant as in other versions. There is plenty of humor, but most of it is very dry and snarky or based on visual gags. It's not meant to be a hilarious, knee-slapping comedy, but it's still funny. It's just not funny in the way most other renditions are. In fact, the picture has this overwhelming atmosphere of gloom and decadence. Everything in this world feels old and sad in some way, and the many arguments, moments of backwards logic, and of course overall nonsensical insanity of Wonderland really do feel sort of like a jab in the gut at the pomposity of adulthood, and especially in upper-class culture. It seems as if the quote-unquote real children in this world are the adult characters, so to speak. There are even quotes featured from a poem by not Lewis Carroll, but instead William Wordsworth, namely his Great Ode, a tragic poem about the effects of aging. If that doesn't spell it out for you, I don't know what will. I personally love this idea in theory. In practice with this production, I don't think it works entirely, because tying this back to Alice, as I said I would, her utter lack of feeling and unresponsive demeanor makes it hard to get a handle of what's going on through her own head, beyond perhaps just remembering what line she's supposed to say next. And if you can't relate to that childlike sense of things, how can you really feel that point come across to its fullest? In my ultimate opinion, it is this choice and this choice alone that truly damages the overall product. As I've explained in previous versions, Alice herself being the weakest character is not always unusual, and as long as there's plenty to balance things out and entertain you, you'll still enjoy the ride. It really is the characters of Wonderland we come to see. But the more focus you put on Alice, the more careful you have to be, and we spend a lot of time with this version of the character. And considering she's the most boring character in the entire film, that makes for a big problem. To be fair, it's entirely possible that, much like with Michael Gough, I just might not be able to get what it is Miller and the creative team are trying to accomplish. Maybe there's more thought put into this choice and sense of direction than I expected, and maybe the very things I've complained about were part of that concept. In fact, there's a few scenes where I noticed that Anne-Marie Malik's lips start to quiver as if she's about to laugh, so maybe she's actually restraining herself. Whatever the case, if this is so, it does not necessarily make things better. I've said before how many people didn't understand what was going on with Johnny Depp's Mad Hatter, and that confusion is arguably the main reason people dislike that performance. However, I knew what was going on, and as a result, I still like Depp's work in the 2010 picture. With that said, though, you shouldn't have to be me, so to speak, in order to enjoy a product or a performance. And when something baffles you in a negative way, even after knowing so much about the concepts of the product, to the point where you're not sure if it was a mistake or not, and honestly don't even know if you care, then something has gone seriously wrong. All the same, the concepts of this movie are, at the very least, truly fascinating to see at work. If you're a fan of the Carroll classics or surrealist filmmaking, you owe it to yourself to check this picture out. And so we come to the conclusions. Rating 7 out of 10. Many critics and Carrollian scholars tend to name this as one of the absolute best versions of Alice out there, if not the best. I, however, am not most critics or Carrollian scholars. I appreciate Miller's ambitions and concepts, and I think they are absolutely fascinating. Most of the cast is phenomenal, the music is honestly one of my favorite soundtracks for any version of Wonderland. I'll even say the unsettling atmosphere hits me in a good spot, perhaps ironically. But this production really needed a stronger Alice who we could truly understand and identify with to make it work to its fullest potential. And Anne-Marie Malik does not deliver on that front. It is a tragic case where one single performance not necessarily ruins the whole product, but does drag it down, in my humble opinion, from truly being among the absolute greats. Top 6 performances and characters. Alan Bennett as the mouse with the long, sad tail. Bennett's version of the character may not get to actually relate his long, sad tail with an E in this rendition, but his foppish and dandified performance is a highlight for me. Wilfred Bramble is the White Rabbit. Bramble is a decidedly snappy and snippy take on the White Rabbit, constantly frustrated with a bit of a vicious sense of humor. While the character in the book has his mean moments, generally when surrounded by his dim-witted servants, he is generally depicted as a relatively mild character, so this is a fresh sort of spin for me. It still feels like the White Rabbit, just a little more cross. Peter Sellers and Alison Leggett as the King and Queen of Hearts. Sellers' fumbling, bumbling king is one of the first I think of when I think of the character, and he steals every scene he has. Leggett's Queen is a little underplayed, but in a special sort of way. She's very mercurial, going from refined and frosty to truly chilling and literally screaming like a banshee the very next second. You're never sure when she'll explode, making her a particularly unnerving antagonist. Leo McKern is the Duchess. As I've said before, the Duchess has been played as a drag role on several occasions, and McKern's is one of the absolute best turns in the role handled this way. The character is incredibly funny, but there are a couple of moments where he, or should I say she, can actually be unsettling too, once again adding to the atmosphere. Peter Cook is the Mad Hatter, yet another Hatter who seems to work off the presumption that Carol's character suffered from mercury poisoning. Cook's Hatter, much like Dreamchild's, exhibits many of the classic symptoms, but the character is handled in a much more lighthearted way, frequently smiling and chortling his way through the story, but never really seeming to be fully aware of what's going on around him. And Sir Michael Redgrave as the Caterpillar. I could watch this sequence over and over and be just as satisfied as if I watched the whole movie. I'm not sure what it is that makes Redgrave's caterpillar so interesting, to be entirely honest, but I think this scene may be an occasion where Miller's concepts gel in a very organic and near-perfect way, and Redgrave's stuffy and slightly mysterious performance of the character helps there a great deal. Who knows what other wonders await you down the rabbit hole? Join me next time to find out. This is JJ Hatter, and never forget, we're all mad here.